What's wrong with my new tattoo? When I showed my tattoo artist the design for my mom's memorial tattoo, he stared at it for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep standing up. You sure about this? He finally said. Yeah, she drew it herself before she died. I said, okay. He responded in this defeated voice and proceeded to work in complete silence for the next 3 hours. When he finished, he wrapped it quickly without looking me in the eye. I gave him a good tip anyway and left, delighted he'd captured my mom's vision so well. But when I got home and showed my girlfriend Olivia, she literally jumped backward off the couch. What is that? She asked, staying on the other side of the room. Don't you think it came out great? I said. She kept opening and closing her mouth like she'd forgotten how to speak. Olivia slept on the couch that night saying she felt sick, but I could hear her on the phone with someone at 2 a.m. whispering, I don't know what to do, over and over. I was worried about her, but by the time I got up for work, she was gone. That day, I wore a tank top to let the tattoo breathe while it healed. My coworker saw it and dropped her coffee mug, which shattered all over the break room floor. Sorry, she said, staring at my shoulder like she'd seen something horrible. Is it that bad? I asked, trying to joke, but she just backed away. By lunch, I'd been called into HR. We've had multiple complaints about your tattoo, the director said. Complaints? I said, genuinely confused. You'll need to keep it covered at all times in the office, she said. This is your only warning. What's wrong with it? I said. It's just a memorial tattoo. She just shook her head. I'm not trying to upset people, I said. Could you tell me what the complaints were about? I asked. So I can understand? Just keep it covered, she said, not meeting my eyes. That morning, I'd posted a photo on Instagram that night with a caption about my mom. I checked it now to see if anyone had said anything that would explain how people were acting and saw it had been deleted for violating community guidelines. Facebook deleted it too. When I asked on Reddit, they banned me for hateful content. I messaged the moderator asking what was hateful about a memorial tattoo. They replied, if this is real, you need serious help, and blocked me. I sat on my bed staring at my shoulder in the mirror. What were they seeing that I wasn't? Olivia hadn't come home, so I went to her sister's place. Can we please talk? I asked through the door. There's nothing to talk about, Olivia said. I don't understand what's happening, I said. The fact that you don't see the problem is the problem, she said. Olivia, please, I said, and I could hear my voice cracking. I love you. Tell me what's wrong. The door stayed closed. I wore long sleeves to work, but 3 days later, HR called me back and said I was being let go for cultural fit issues. Is this about the tattoo? I asked, feeling my chest tighten. We wish you the best. I stopped at the grocery store to get something cheap for dinner, and a woman saw my shoulder when my sleeve rode up and grabbed her kid, abandoning her full cart. The look on her face wasn't just disgust, it was fear. Ma'am, wait, I called after her. What do you see? She walked faster. That night, my best friend heard I lost my job and got me out of the house for a drink, but when I took off my jacket, he immediately stood up. Not you too, I said, and I felt tears starting. Come on, we've been friends since college. Your mom drew that? He asked. Yes, I said. She died 6 months ago. This was the last thing she drew. And you put it on your body permanently? What am I not seeing? I asked. Please, I'm begging you. You're my best friend. If you can't see it, then I can't help you, he said, and left. I went home and drank alone, staring at the tattoo until my eyes burned. I traced every line, every curve, looking for something hidden. It was just geometric patterns, interlocking shapes that my mom had sketched while she was dying. I went to the tattoo place to see if they could explain, but they refused to see me. I spent days searching online, comparing the design to every symbol database I could find. Religious symbols, hate symbols, gang signs, occult imagery, nothing matched. I posted on forums with throwaway accounts begging for answers. Every post got deleted within minutes. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I'd lost my job, my girlfriend, my friends, my apartment, all because of a tattoo that meant everything to me and something horrible to everyone else. My dad finally called after my aunt told him, Son, where did you get that design? Mom drew it, I said, exhausted. Dad, please, I'm losing everything. Where did she see it? In a dream, I said. She said it came to her in a dream before she died. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. You need to get that removed. Dad, what is it? I said. What did Mom draw? I can't tell you that, he said. But your mother didn't know what she was drawing. She couldn't have known. He paused, and I could hear his breathing change. God, what if she knew? What? I asked. My dad's breath caught, and he said, There's something you need to know about your mother. I couldn't sleep that night. Dad's words kept playing in my head over and over while I stood in front of the bathroom mirror staring at the tattoo. What could Mom have possibly known about this design? What didn't she know? The geometric shapes looked different now, sinister in a way I couldn't explain, but everyone else seemed to see immediately. I traced the interlocking triangles with my finger until my shoulder ached. When morning light came through the window, I grabbed my phone and called Dad back. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting. I didn't bother with hello. I told him I needed to know everything about Mom's past before she got sick, everything about her work, everything he'd been keeping from me. My voice came out harder than I meant it to, but I was done with secrets. Dad was quiet for a long moment, and then he said he'd meet me at the diner on Fletcher Street in 2 hours. His voice sounded heavy, like something between regret and relief, like he'd been carrying this weight alone and was finally ready to set it down. I said I'd be there and hung up. 2 hours felt like forever, so I opened my laptop and started searching. I typed Mom's full name and social services agency into the search bar. The results came back slowly. Old newspaper archives and agency reports from the late 90s. I found mentions of child welfare cases, something about recovered children and successful prosecutions. Mom's name appeared in several articles as a caseworker who provided testimony. I clicked through page after page, my stomach getting tighter with each new detail. One article mentioned a particularly difficult case involving multiple victims. Another referenced the trauma that social workers experienced from these investigations. I saved everything I found to a folder on my desktop. By the time I needed to leave for the diner, I had 20 documents open, and none of them explained the design on my shoulder. The diner was half empty when I arrived. Dad sat in a back booth, and he looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His hair seemed grayer, his shoulders slumped forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. He had a worn cardboard box on the table in front of him, the kind that holds old files or documents. I slid into the booth across from him and stared at the box. Dad's hands shook as he pushed it toward me across the sticky table. He said these were Mom's old work notebooks and personal sketches from before I was born. He'd kept them in storage all these years because Mom wanted them preserved but never looked at. His voice cracked when he said he should have gone through them after she died, should have checked what was inside before I got that tattoo. He opened the box and pulled out the first notebook. The pages were yellowed and the spiral binding was bent. He flipped it open to show me the margins filled with geometric doodles, small triangles connected to spirals, patterns that looked almost random until you saw how they repeated. I grabbed the notebook from him and started turning pages. The same shapes appeared everywhere, sometimes barely visible in corners of case notes, other times taking up entire sheets of paper. Interlocking triangles, spirals that curved inward, geometric patterns that made my skin crawl, now that I knew everyone else could see something in them I couldn't. I pulled out another notebook and found the same drawings, then another. Dozens of pages filled with these patterns, some drawn carefully with straight lines, others sketched quickly like Mom couldn't get them out of her head fast enough. Dad watched me go through the notebooks, and then he started talking. He said Mom began drawing these patterns after a really hard case involving recovered children. She told him the shapes helped her process the trauma, that drawing them over and over made the images in her head less powerful. She claimed they were just abstract designs that calmed her mind during the hardest period of her career. Dad said he never understood the drawings, but Mom insisted they meant nothing, just geometric patterns that helped her cope. His voice got quieter when he admitted he'd been carrying guilt about this for years. He should have pressed her harder about what those cases exposed her to, what she might have witnessed or heard about from the children she interviewed. He should have made her get real therapy instead of just accepting that she was handling it on her own. But Mom was so strong, so determined to protect me from the darkness of her work. She never brought it home, never talked about the details. She just drew these patterns in her notebooks and told him everything was fine. I pulled out my phone while Dad was talking. My hands were shaking as I opened the browser and typed child exploitation symbols into the search bar. The results made my stomach turn. I clicked on an FBI awareness campaign and scrolled through pages of symbols used by predators and traffickers. Triangular spiral patterns appeared in the database, listed as recognized indicators. The similarities weren't exact, but they were close enough. Close enough to explain why the tattoo artist stared at my design for so long. Close enough to explain why Olivia jumped backward off the couch. Close enough to explain why my coworker dropped her coffee mug and why HR fired me and why that woman grabbed her kid at the grocery store. Close enough to explain every single horrified reaction I'd received. I showed Dad the screen and watched his face crumble. He started crying quietly, tears running down his cheeks while he stared at the images. He said he'd suspected this might be the explanation, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. He couldn't accept that Mom would have taken something so dark and put it on paper over and over, that she would have drawn it one last time before she died, and I would put it on my body permanently. He kept saying he should have known, should have checked, should have warned me. I felt sick sitting there in that booth. My memorial tattoo, the last thing Mom drew before cancer took her, was broadcasting association with the worst kind of harm a person could do. People weren't seeing a tribute to my mother. They were seeing a symbol connected to child exploitation, to trafficking, to monsters who hurt kids. No wonder everyone reacted with fear and disgust. No wonder social media platforms deleted my posts immediately. No wonder I'd lost everything. I stood up so fast the booth seat squeaked. Anger flooded through me, hot and overwhelming. I was angry at Dad for not warning me sooner, for keeping Mom's notebooks hidden away instead of going through them. I was angry at Mom for drawing this design without understanding what it meant, for processing her trauma in a way that created this nightmare for me. I was angry at myself for not researching the design before I walked into that tattoo shop, for being so desperate to honor her memory that I didn't think about what the shapes might mean to other people. Dad called after me as I grabbed the box of notebooks and headed for the door. He said my name 3 times, but I couldn't stay there. I needed space to process this, to figure out what to do next. I pushed through the diner door into the parking lot, and the sunlight felt too bright, too normal for what I'd just learned. I sat in my car with the box of notebooks on the passenger seat and pulled out my phone again. I searched laser tattoo removal and clicked on the first clinic that came up. The website explained the process, how lasers break up the ink particles so your body can absorb them. I clicked through to the pricing page and my chest got tight. Full removal of a shoulder piece this size would cost thousands of dollars. The site said most tattoos required 6 to 8 sessions, spaced 6 to 8 weeks apart. I did the math in my head. Even at the low end, that was 9 months of treatments. 9 months of walking around with this symbol on my body while it slowly faded. 9 months of covering it up and avoiding people and living with the fear that someone would see it and think I was something I'm not. The financial reality hit me hard. I'd lost my job 3 days ago. I was staying in temporary housing and burning through what little savings I had. How was I supposed to afford thousands of dollars for laser removal when I couldn't even afford next month's rent? I searched for clinics in my area and found one called Advanced Dermatology with good reviews. They had a page specifically about tattoo removal, and the doctor's name was listed as Dr. Sophie Lauer. I clicked on the contact page and called the number before I could talk myself out of it. A receptionist answered, and I asked about consultations for laser tattoo removal. She said the next available appointment was in 3 days, Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon. I booked it and gave her my information. Her tone stayed professional the whole time, no judgment or questions about why I needed removal. I wondered if that would change when I showed up, and she saw what needed removing. I wondered if Dr. Sophie Lauer would look at my shoulder and react the same way everyone else had, with fear or disgust or both. But I didn't have a choice. This tattoo had already cost me my job, my girlfriend, my friends, my apartment. I couldn't let it cost me anything else. I had to get it removed, no matter how long it took, or how much it cost, or how much it hurt. I drove back to my temporary housing and spent the rest of that day researching laser removal testimonials and cost breakdowns. Every article I found made the price seem worse and the timeline longer. People talked about needing 10 or 12 sessions for stubborn ink. Some said the pain was unbearable. Others posted photos of scarring and discoloration that never fully healed. I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling, trying not to think about how I'd pay for any of this. The next morning, I woke up with the idea to post something on social media explaining the whole situation. I opened Instagram and started typing about Mom's drawings and her work with traumatized kids and how I never knew what the symbol meant. I wrote 3 paragraphs before deleting everything. It sounded defensive and unbelievable. I tried again on Facebook with a simpler version, but that felt worse, like I was making excuses. I spent hours drafting and deleting posts, trying different tones and approaches, but nothing captured the impossible situation without sounding like I was lying or deflecting blame. By the second day, I'd given up on social media entirely. I stayed inside wearing long sleeves even though my apartment was hot. I ordered food delivery and tipped extra so the driver wouldn't have to come to my door. I kept checking my phone for messages from Olivia or my best friend, but there was nothing. The silence from everyone I cared about hurt worse than the active rejection. On the 3rd day, I took a shower and put on the most conservative shirt I owned, making sure the collar came up high enough to hide my shoulder completely. I drove to Advanced Dermatology 30 minutes early and sat in my car rehearsing what I'd say when Dr. Lauer asked about the tattoo. Would she react like everyone else? Would she refuse to treat me once she saw it? The receptionist called my name at exactly 2 o'clock and led me back to an exam room. Dr. Lauer came in 5 minutes later carrying a tablet and wearing a white coat over blue scrubs. She looked to be in her 40s with dark hair pulled back and an expression that seemed professionally neutral. She asked me to remove my shirt and show her the tattoo. I hesitated, then pulled my shirt over my head and turned so she could see my shoulder. Dr. Lauer stepped closer and examined the design without saying anything. Her face stayed calm and focused, like she was looking at any other medical issue. She took photos with her tablet from different angles and asked how long I'd had it. I told her 3 weeks. She asked if I'd had any allergic reactions or complications during healing. I said no. She pulled up a chair and explained how laser removal works, describing how the light breaks up ink particles so my body can absorb them. Her voice stayed even and professional the whole time. She said a tattoo this size with this much dark ink would need at least 8 sessions, spaced 6 to 8 weeks apart. Each session would cost $400. I did the math in my head and felt my chest get tight. $3,200 minimum, probably more. Dr. Alauer pulled up before and after photos on her tablet showing other removal cases. She explained that complete removal might not be possible, and I'd likely have some scarring or shadow images remaining where the ink was densest. The geometric patterns would fade, but probably never disappear entirely. Something about that felt right, like I deserved to carry some permanent mark of this mistake. Dr. Alauer asked if I wanted to schedule sessions over the next several months, or if I wanted to start today. I stared at her. She said if I was ready to commit to the full treatment plan, she had an opening this afternoon and could do the first session now. The sooner we started, the sooner we'd see results. I asked about payment, and she directed me to their financing partner. The receptionist gave me paperwork, and I filled it out in the waiting room, listing my income and expenses and feeling sick about how little cushion I had left. The financing company approved me for partial coverage with monthly payments of $140. It was barely manageable, but I signed anyway. Removing this tattoo wasn't optional anymore. Dr. Alauer brought me back to a different room with a large machine and a reclining chair. She had me lie face down and applied numbing cream to my shoulder, telling me to wait 20 minutes for it to take effect. When she came back, she put protective goggles over my eyes and warned me the laser would feel like hot grease hitting my skin. She wasn't exaggerating. The first pulse felt like someone had flicked burning oil across my shoulder blade. The second pulse hit the same spot, and I gripped the chair arms. Dr. Alauer worked in sections, firing the laser in rapid bursts that made my whole shoulder feel like it was cooking. The smell of burning ink mixed with something chemical and sharp. 20 minutes felt like an hour. When she finally stopped and turned off the machine, I was sweating and my hands were shaking. Dr. Alauer applied more numbing cream and covered the area with gauze, then gave me a printed sheet of aftercare instructions. Keep it covered for 48 hours. Apply the cream 3 times daily. Avoid sun exposure. No swimming or soaking. Come back in 6 weeks for the second session. I thanked her and paid the receptionist, then walked out to my car feeling the treated area swelling under my shirt. A woman was getting out of her car 2 spots over and she glanced at me. I panicked, thinking she could somehow see through my shirt to the tattoo underneath. My heart started racing, and I got in my car fast, locking the doors like that would protect me. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't shake it. Every person who looked at me felt like a threat. That evening, I sat at my laptop and searched for attorneys who handle wrongful termination cases. Most of the websites looked expensive and corporate. I found one named Jared Baker, who specialized in employment discrimination and offered free consultations. His site said he'd handled cases involving workplace harassment, wrongful firing, and retaliation claims. I drafted an email explaining my situation, attaching the termination letter from HR and my documentation of the tattoo and its unintended meaning. I wasn't sure if I even had a case, but I needed to explore every option. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Jared responded the next morning asking me to come in for a meeting. His office was in a small building near downtown, nothing fancy but professional-looking. I arrived 15 minutes early and waited in a lobby with outdated magazines and a receptionist who barely looked up. Jared came out at exactly 10 o'clock, a guy in his late 30s wearing khakis and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He shook my hand and led me back to his office, which was cluttered with file boxes and legal books. He said he'd reviewed everything I sent. His assessment was straightforward and not what I wanted to hear. Cultural fit terminations are really hard to fight in court. Employers have a lot of leeway to fire people for reasons that make other employees uncomfortable. The fact that my tattoo resembled hate symbols, even unintentionally, complicated any discrimination argument I might make. He said we could try to argue that the firing was rushed or that HR didn't follow proper procedures, but those were weak angles. Jared leaned back in his chair and said what we could realistically push for was a settlement. My former employer probably didn't want publicity about this situation. We could request neutral references and a small severance payment, maybe 2 or 3 months of salary. It wasn't the vindication I wanted, but it was more realistic than a lengthy lawsuit I couldn't afford. I asked what his fees would be. Jared said his standard rate was $250 an hour, but he'd work on contingency for any settlement we secured. If we got nothing, he got nothing. That was the only way I could afford representation right now. He said he'd send a letter to my former employer's legal team outlining our concerns about the termination process and requesting a mediation meeting. He'd frame it carefully, not aggressive, but firm enough to show we were serious. I signed his representation agreement and left feeling slightly less helpless than I had in weeks. That afternoon, I sat at my laptop searching for remote contract positions that wouldn't require video interviews or in-person meetings. My resume looked solid on paper with 5 years of data analysis experience and a degree from a decent state school. I opened a spreadsheet and started tracking applications, carefully writing cover letters that explained my interest in remote work without mentioning the real reason I needed to stay invisible. I applied to 3 positions that first day, then 5 more the next morning, focusing on companies that advertised fully distributed teams. The work was tedious, but it gave me something concrete to control when everything else felt like chaos. I checked my email obsessively for responses, refreshing the page every few minutes, even though I knew most companies took at least a week to review applications. 2 weeks later, I returned to the dermatology clinic for my second laser session. Dr. Lauer examined my shoulder under the bright exam light and pointed out areas where the ink had already started breaking up into smaller fragments. The darkest lines were still solid, but some of the lighter geometric patterns looked blurry now, less defined than before. She applied the numbing cream, and I braced myself for the pain. The laser felt just as intense as the first time, each pulse like a rubber band snap, followed by burning heat that spread across my skin. I counted the pulses to distract myself, making it to 47 before losing track. When Dr. Lauer finished, she photographed the treated area for my file and reminded me about the aftercare routine. I paid at the front desk using the financing plan and walked back to my car with my shoulder throbbing under the bandage. Dad called me that evening while I was heating up frozen pizza for dinner. I almost didn't answer because I was still carrying some anger about him keeping secrets, but I picked up on the third ring. His voice sounded tired, and he asked how I was holding up with everything. I told him about the laser session and the job applications, keeping my tone neutral. He said he'd been thinking a lot about Mom and the work she did before I was born, admitting he should have been more supportive when she was struggling with those cases. We talked for over an hour about the child welfare work and how it changed her, Dad filling in details I'd never known. He described how Mom would come home silent after particularly bad days, sitting in the dark living room for hours without turning on any lights. She'd stopped talking about her cases entirely after I was born, like she'd made a decision to compartmentalize that part of her life completely. Dad mentioned near the end of our call that Mom's old supervisor from the social services agency had recently retired. Her name was Nia Robinson, and she'd worked closely with Mom during those difficult years in the late 90s. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He sounded hesitant bringing it up, but said Nia might be willing to talk about that period if I wanted more context about what Mom experienced. I asked if he thought it would help, and he said honestly, he didn't know, but understanding Mom's work might give me a way to process why she drew those patterns. He gave me Nia's professional email address that he'd found on a retirement announcement and said I should mention his name when I reached out. I drafted an email to Nia that night, rewriting it 4 times before I felt like the tone was right. I explained who I was and asked if she'd be willing to discuss Mom's work during her time in child welfare services. I attached a photo of the tattoo design, but I'd edited it heavily to blur the most recognizable elements while keeping the basic geometric structure visible. I asked directly if she recognized the pattern from any cases Mom might have worked on. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I finally clicked it and closed my laptop. Nia responded within 3 hours, which surprised me since it was almost 11 at night. Her message was warm but straightforward, saying she remembered my mom well and had been sad to hear about her death. She confirmed that the geometric pattern in my photo resembled symbols that had been documented in several high-profile child exploitation cases from the mid to late 90s. Mom had been directly involved in interviewing recovered children who described seeing similar markings in the places where they'd been held. Nia's email included links to archived news articles about those cases, though she warned me the details were disturbing. She said Mom was one of the lead caseworkers who helped coordinate testimony and support services for the children after they were recovered. Nia's next paragraph explained that Mom had been deeply affected by those cases in ways that went beyond normal professional stress. She'd started having nightmares and anxiety attacks, eventually requesting a transfer to adult services because the child welfare work was causing what they now recognized as secondary trauma. Nia believed the geometric drawings were Mom's subconscious way of processing the images and symbols the children had described in their victim statements. The children had talked about seeing these patterns on walls, on documents, even tattooed on some of the adults involved. Mom had sat through hours of interviews hearing these descriptions over and over, and apparently the shapes had burned themselves into her memory. I read Nia's email 3 times, feeling something shift in my understanding. Mom hadn't drawn a hate symbol on purpose. She'd drawn something that represented the worst trauma she'd ever witnessed, something that had damaged her so badly she'd had to leave the work entirely. The tattoo wasn't about her values or beliefs. It was about her pain, about images she couldn't get out of her head even decades later. But that distinction didn't change anything about how the world saw the symbol or what it meant to people who recognized it. The intent didn't matter when the impact was the same. Nia ended her email by offering to speak with me by phone if I wanted more details about Mom's work and the cases she'd handled. She said she had the next evening free and could call me around 7 if that worked. She warned me that some of what she'd share might be difficult to hear, but she thought I deserved to understand the full context of what Mom had experienced. I replied immediately saying yes, and including my phone number. Nia called at exactly 7 the next evening. I was sitting on my couch with a notebook ready to take notes, but I barely wrote anything down because I was too focused on listening. Nia described Mom as one of the most dedicated child advocates she'd ever worked with, someone who fought hard for vulnerable kids, even when the system made it nearly impossible. She walked me through specific cases where Mom's testimony had helped secure convictions against people who'd hurt children, describing how Mom would spend hours preparing kids for court appearances and making sure they felt safe enough to tell their stories. Nia's voice got emotional talking about Mom's commitment and how much she'd sacrificed to do that work. She painted a picture of someone heroic and brave, someone who'd chosen to face horrible things because she believed protecting children mattered more than protecting herself from trauma. Nia's voice got quiet for a moment before she continued. She said there were things Mom mentioned in supervision sessions that made her wonder if Mom had personal experience with abuse, though Mom never said anything directly about it. The way Mom talked about certain cases and the specific details that seemed to affect her most suggested she might have recognized something from her own past. Nia was careful to say this was just her impression and she could be completely wrong, but the possibility had stayed with her over the years. I felt my chest tighten hearing this, because it added another layer to everything, making the tattoo feel like it carried trauma that went back further than I'd realized. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time, trying to process the idea that Mom might have been drawing something connected to her own pain, not just the cases she worked. I called Nia back the next day and asked if she thought I should make some kind of public statement explaining where the tattoo came from, since people were assuming the worst about me, and I had no way to defend myself. She told me to think carefully about it because explanations could sometimes make things worse if they weren't handled right. People might not believe the story, or might think I was making excuses, and once something was out there, I couldn't take it back. We talked through the pros and cons for almost an hour, with Nia asking questions about what I hoped to accomplish and whether I was prepared for negative responses. She said if I decided to do it, the statement would need to be very carefully worded to acknowledge the harm without being defensive. A few days later, Nia emailed me contact information for a crisis communication consultant she knew who helped people navigate reputation damage, saying this person had experience with situations where someone had caused unintended harm. I looked up the consultant's fees, and they were way beyond what I could afford, especially with no job and mounting debt. I emailed Nia back explaining I couldn't pay for professional help, and she responded offering to help me draft a statement herself if I decided that was the right path. She said she'd do it pro bono because she felt connected to the situation through Mom and wanted to help me handle it responsibly. Over the next week, we worked together through email, going back and forth on different versions of a statement. Nia helped me find language that acknowledged the tattoo's resemblance to harmful symbols without making excuses, explained the unintentional origin through Mom's trauma work, and outlined the steps I was taking for removal. She pushed me to take more accountability than I initially wanted to, cutting phrases where I sounded like a victim and adding clearer statements about understanding why people reacted the way they did. The final version was 3 paragraphs that felt honest, without being defensive, and Nia said it struck the right tone. I posted the statement on my personal social media accounts with comments disabled, including a photo of Dr. Lauer's treatment schedule showing all my upcoming laser removal sessions. Within an hour, the post had been shared dozens of times, and the responses were all over the place. Some people said they appreciated the explanation and believed I hadn't meant harm, while others said the story sounded made up, or that I should have researched the design before getting it tattooed. A few people were hostile, saying intent didn't matter, and I should have known better regardless of the circumstances. I tried not to read too many of the responses because they were making me feel worse, but I kept checking anyway. The same day I posted the statement, Jared called to say my former employer's legal team had responded to his letter. They were offering mediation instead of fighting the termination, which Jared said suggested they knew their position wasn't great. He walked me through their preliminary offer, which included a modest severance payment and an agreement to provide neutral employment references going forward. The severance was 3 months of my salary, not as much as I'd hoped for, but more than nothing. Jared said we could probably push for a bit more in the actual mediation session, but he wanted me to have realistic expectations. The mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks out at a neutral location downtown. When the day came, I put on the only suit I still owned and met Jared in the lobby of an office building I'd never been to before. We rode the elevator up to the 10th floor and walked into a conference room where my former HR director sat with their attorney. The atmosphere felt tense but professional, as everyone shook hands and sat down. The mediator explained the process, and then both sides presented their positions. The employer's attorney argued that the termination was justified based on multiple complaints and the disruption my tattoo had caused in the workplace. Jared countered that the process had been rushed and that I'd been fired before being given a real chance to address the situation through accommodation or other means. I sat there trying to stay calm while they talked about me like I wasn't in the room, feeling angry about how I'd been treated, but knowing I needed to keep it together. The HR director wouldn't look at me directly the whole time. After about 2 hours of back-and-forth negotiation, we reached a settlement. 3 months of severance pay, neutral references that would only confirm my dates of employment and job title, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement about the circumstances of my termination. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't feel like justice, but it gave me some financial breathing room and removed a barrier to finding new work. Jared seemed satisfied with the outcome and said I should feel good about holding them accountable, at least a little bit. I signed the papers and walked out feeling exhausted but relieved. With the settlement money coming, I was able to pay down some of my debt and cover the next few laser removal sessions without relying entirely on the financing plan. The relief of having stable income again, even temporarily, helped me sleep better for the first time in weeks. I could buy groceries without checking my bank account first, and I stopped having panic attacks every time my phone buzzed with a notification. The settlement also meant I could list my previous employer on job applications without worrying they'd trash me to potential new employers. I started applying for remote positions doing data analysis, focusing on small consulting firms that wouldn't require in-person interviews where someone might see the tattoo. My resume was solid despite the abrupt job loss, and I was careful in my cover letters to frame the departure as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities. Within 3 weeks, I got a call from a small firm that needed someone to help with a 6-month contract project. The interview was over video call and went well, and they offered me the position at the end of the week. The pay wasn't as good as my old job, but it was enough to cover basic expenses and keep my resume active while I continued the removal process. The work was straightforward data analysis that I could do from my apartment, and nobody would see the tattoo while it was removed. I accepted the offer immediately and started the following Monday, feeling like I'd finally stopped the freefall and found some solid ground. The third laser session came 2 weeks after I started the consulting job. I drove to Dr. Lauer's office feeling less panicked than before, knowing I had income and a plan moving forward. She examined the treated area under her bright lamp and nodded slowly. The lighter parts of the design were definitely fading, she said, though the darkest lines would need several more treatments to break down enough for removal. She asked how I was doing emotionally, and I told her the truth. The anxiety hadn't gone away, and I still felt isolated most of the time, avoiding places where people might see my shoulder, even though it was covered. She listened without interrupting, and then mentioned something I hadn't expected. Many of her patients dealing with regrettable tattoos benefited from therapy to process the psychological impact, she said. She handed me a card for a counselor who specialized in body image issues and trauma. I looked at the card and added it mentally to my growing list of things I couldn't quite afford, but probably needed. The session itself hurt just as much as the previous ones, that same feeling of hot grease spattering across my skin for 20 minutes. I gritted my teeth through it and tried to think about the progress, about how each treatment brought me closer to erasing this mistake. When she finished and wrapped the area, I thanked her and scheduled the 4th session for 6 weeks out. Driving home, I thought about the therapy referral and wondered if I could squeeze it into my budget somehow. Dad called that evening while I was making dinner in my small apartment kitchen. He said he'd been thinking about what we discussed at the diner and wanted me to come over to go through more of Mom's belongings. There were photo albums and journals I might want to see, he said. His voice sounded tired but determined. I felt my stomach tighten at the thought of what I might find, but I agreed. Understanding Mom more fully was part of healing from this, even if it hurt. We set a date for that weekend, and I spent the next few days feeling nervous about what those journals might reveal. Saturday morning, I drove to Dad's house and found him waiting on the front porch. He looked older somehow, like the weight of these revelations had physically aged him. We went inside, and he led me up to the attic, a space I hadn't been in since I was a kid searching for Christmas presents. He pulled down several cardboard boxes marked with Mom's name and dates from the 90s. We carried them downstairs to the living room and started opening them one by one. Inside were journals from different periods of her life, spiral notebooks filled with her neat handwriting. I started reading and couldn't stop. Her entries about the child welfare cases were detailed and raw, describing children she'd interviewed and families she'd tried to help. The writing revealed deep compassion mixed with rage at the systems that failed these kids over and over. I saw where my own sense of justice came from, that burning anger at unfairness that I'd always thought was just part of my personality. It came from her, from years of fighting battles she mostly lost. One journal entry from shortly before I was born stopped me cold. Mom wrote about her decision to leave child welfare work, explaining that she couldn't continue exposing herself to such darkness while trying to bring a child into the world. She wanted to be a mother who could focus on hope rather than horror, she wrote. She wanted to give me a childhood that wasn't shadowed by the things she'd seen. I read that passage 3 times, tears blurring the words. Dad was reading another journal across from me, and when I showed him that entry, he started crying too. We sat there together grieving not just Mom's death, but the weight she'd carried silently for so many years. He admitted he knew she struggled, but never pushed her to talk about the specifics, respecting her need to compartmentalize her work life. Now he wondered if that had been the right choice, or if he should have insisted she get help processing the trauma. I asked Dad if he thought Mom would be horrified to know what her drawing became. He was quiet for a long moment, and then said honestly that she'd be devastated, but would also understand it wasn't my fault. She would hate that her pain had caused me pain, he said. We agreed that the best way to honor her was to remove the tattoo while remembering the good she did in her career, the children she helped, and the families she fought for. The drawing was just one manifestation of her trauma, not the sum of who she was. That conversation helped more than I expected, giving me permission to let go of the image while keeping the memory of her strength. The 4th laser session showed continued progress. Dr. Lauer took photos and showed me the comparison with the first session. About 40% of the ink was now significantly faded, she said. The design was still visible but much lighter, especially in the areas with thinner lines. She estimated I'd need at least 4 more sessions to get to a point where a skilled cover-up artist could work with what remained. That timeline felt both endless and manageable. I was healing slowly, both the physical tattoo and the psychological damage it had caused. She asked if I'd followed up with the therapist, and I admitted I hadn't yet due to cost. She nodded and said to reach out when I was ready, that the referral would still be valid. Back home, I started researching cover-up artists who specialized in transforming problematic tattoos into something meaningful. I spent hours looking at portfolios and reading reviews, searching for someone who could take the faded remains of this nightmare and turn it into something I could live with. I found Troy Watkins, whose work showed incredible skill at reimagining difficult pieces. His portfolio included several cover-ups of hate symbols and gang tattoos, transforming them into beautiful nature scenes and abstract designs. His consultation fee was steep at $200, but I bookmarked his website and started saving. I'd book an appointment after my removal sessions were complete, giving myself something to look forward to. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I still had saved, Olivia. My heart jumped, seeing her name on the screen. She said she'd seen my public statement and wanted me to know she didn't think I was a bad person. She was clear that she wasn't ready to reconnect, but wanted to offer that small piece of closure. I read the message 5 times, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. It meant more than she probably realized, knowing she didn't hate me even if she couldn't be with me. I typed out a response thanking her and moved forward with my day, carrying that tiny bit of forgiveness like a fragile gift. I opened my phone and typed out a response to Olivia, keeping it short and honest. I thanked her for reaching out and apologized again for the trauma my ignorance had caused her. I hit send and watched the message show as delivered, then read. She didn't reply, and I sat there for probably 20 minutes staring at the screen before I accepted she wouldn't. I set the phone down and went to make dinner, feeling like maybe I'd taken one tiny step toward earning forgiveness, even if it was just from myself. 3 days later, my phone buzzed during my morning coffee, and I nearly dropped the mug when I saw my best friend's name on the screen. His message was longer than Olivia's, more careful with the words. He said he'd been thinking about everything and wanted me to know he didn't hate me. He wrote that he needed more time to process his own reaction, but maybe eventually we could rebuild our friendship once enough distance had passed. I read the message 5 times, then typed back that I understood and respected whatever boundary he needed. I told him I missed him and would be here whenever he was ready. He sent back a thumbs up emoji and nothing else, but it was something. The remote contract work had been going well for about 6 weeks when my supervisor scheduled a video call to discuss my performance. I assumed it was routine feedback, but she opened by saying the company wanted to offer me a permanent position. The role came with full benefits including health insurance, a modest salary bump from my contract rate, and the same remote flexibility I'd been enjoying. She explained that the company culture was professional and location independent, which meant my physical appearance wouldn't be a daily concern for anyone. I accepted on the spot and felt this surge of relief wash through my whole body. Having stable income again meant I could budget for the remaining laser sessions without constantly juggling payments. It meant I could actually afford therapy eventually, instead of just carrying the referral card around in my wallet. I started believing I might actually pull myself out of this hole and build something stable again. 2 days after accepting the job offer, Nia called to check on my progress with the removal treatments. I updated her on the settlement with my former employer and the new permanent position, and she sounded genuinely pleased. Then she mentioned something about a support group for people who'd experienced unintended harm or association with hate symbols. She said it might help to connect with others navigating similar situations. I was skeptical because group therapy stuff had never really appealed to me, but she sent me the meeting information anyway, along with a note saying, just to consider it. The group met weekly via video call, which made it more accessible, so I bookmarked the email and told myself I'd think about it. A week later, I joined the video call 5 minutes late, my camera off and microphone muted while I decided whether to stay. There were 8 other people on the call, all with their cameras on, and a facilitator who introduced herself and explained the group's focus on accountability without shame. I listened to a guy around my age talk about getting a gang tattoo as a teenager that he didn't understand was a hate symbol until he tried to join the military. A woman shared about accidentally using a slogan in her business marketing that turned out to have white supremacist origins. Their stories were different from mine, but the core experience was the same, that gut punch of realizing you'd caused harm without meaning to and then having to own it anyway. The facilitator emphasized that intent doesn't erase impact, but accountability and changed behavior matter more than performative guilt. I unmuted myself near the end and briefly shared my situation, and several people nodded like they understood. After the call ended, I sat there feeling lighter somehow, like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this specific kind of nightmare. The 5th laser session fell on a Tuesday morning, and Dr. Lauer had me arrive early so she could take detailed before and after photos. She pulled up the images on her computer screen and showed me the comparison with my first session. The difference was dramatic. She estimated about 60% of the ink was now significantly faded, especially in the areas with thinner lines. The tattoo had become this ghost of what it was, still visible if you looked closely, but no longer immediately recognizable as the symbol that had destroyed my life. She said this marked the halfway point in my treatment plan, and we'd need at least 3 or 4 more sessions to get to a point where a skilled cover-up artist could work with what remained. I asked her to schedule the next session right then, and she booked me for 6 weeks out. Walking to my car afterward, I caught my reflection in a store window, and for the first time in months, I didn't immediately look away from my own shoulder. That afternoon, I called Troy Watkins's studio and spoke with his assistant about scheduling a consultation. She asked about my situation, and I gave her the brief version that I was in the middle of laser removal for a problematic tattoo and wanted to discuss cover-up options. She mentioned that Troy had worked with several clients in similar situations and approached these projects with real sensitivity and artistic skill. We scheduled the consultation for 2 months out, which would give me time for 1 more laser session before we discussed the design. The consultation fee was $200, but she said that would be credited toward the final tattoo cost if I decided to move forward. I marked the date in my calendar and felt like I was finally building towards something positive instead of just running damage control. Dad and I started having dinner together every Thursday night, meeting at this diner halfway between our places. The first few dinners were awkward as we figured out how to talk about Mom without all the protective silence we'd maintained for so long. But by the 4th week, we'd found a rhythm, sharing memories and stories that filled in gaps in each other's understanding of who she'd been. Dad mentioned he'd started seeing a therapist to process his own grief and the revelations about Mom's past. He said it was helping him separate his guilt about not protecting her from trauma from his grief about losing her. These dinners became something I looked forward to, this weekly chance to build a relationship with my father that was more honest than what we'd had before. On a Sunday afternoon, I sat down and wrote a letter to the original tattoo artist. I explained everything I'd learned about the design's meaning and the history behind why Mom had drawn it. I thanked him for trying to warn me, even though I'd been too ignorant to understand what he was seeing. I apologized for putting him in that position and told him I was getting the tattoo removed. I didn't expect a response, and I wasn't even sure if he still worked at that shop, but I addressed it there anyway and walked it to the mailbox on the corner. Mailing that letter felt like closing a loop, one more piece of accountability I needed to take care of before I could fully move forward. 2 days later, I checked my mailbox and found a handwritten envelope from the tattoo shop with no return address. Inside was a short note on plain paper saying he appreciated me reaching out and was glad I was getting the removal done, that he'd turned away 2 other clients who wanted that exact design since my session. Because he'd added it to his personal blacklist of symbols he wouldn't ink no matter what story the client gave him. Reading his words made me realize how many other people might have stumbled into the same nightmare if he hadn't learned to recognize it. And I folded the note carefully and put it in the box with Mom's journals as another piece of this whole terrible puzzle. The 6th laser session happened on a Thursday morning, and Dr. Lauer examined my shoulder before starting, commenting that the ink had broken up significantly, and she felt confident a skilled cover artist could work with what would remain after one more treatment. The laser hurt just as much as always, but I focused on her words about being almost done with this phase, counting down the minutes until she finished and applied the cooling gel that took the edge off the burning. She scheduled my final session for 6 weeks out and said after that, I'd need to wait another 6 weeks for complete healing before any cover work could begin, which meant I was looking at 3 more months minimum before this whole thing would be truly behind me. Walking to my car afterward, I called Troy Watkins's studio and moved my consultation up since I'd be ready sooner than originally planned, and his assistant found an opening 2 weeks out that would give me time to start thinking about design ideas. The consultation happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon at his studio in a converted warehouse downtown, and when I walked in, Troy was finishing up with another client, carefully wrapping fresh ink on someone's forearm while talking them through aftercare instructions. He looked up when the door chimed and nodded at me to wait, so I sat in the lobby looking at his portfolio binder full of cover work he'd done, seeing how he'd transformed regrettable tattoos into beautiful new pieces that completely hid what was underneath. When his client left, Troy brought me back to his station and had me take off my shirt, so he could examine the faded tattoo under his bright work light, and he spent several minutes just looking at it from different angles while sketching quick notes on a pad. He asked what was meaningful to me about my mom, and I told him about her love of oak trees, how we used to hike together when I was a kid, and she'd always stop to touch the bark of the biggest oaks we passed, saying they made her feel grounded. Troy nodded and started sketching a landscape design right there, showing me how he could create a scene with a massive oak tree as the centerpiece, its branches spreading across my shoulder blade, while roots wrapped down toward my arm, and he pointed out how the darkest parts of the remaining ink lined up perfectly with where he'd placed the tree trunk and thickest branches. The design felt right immediately, like it honored who Mom actually was, instead of broadcasting the trauma she'd carried, and I told him I wanted to move forward as soon as possible. Troy explained the session would take 6 to 8 hours and warned me that tattooing over laser-treated skin hurts more than normal, because the tissue is damaged and sensitive, but he'd worked with plenty of removal clients before and knew how to manage the process. We scheduled the cover work for 3 months out to give my skin maximum healing time, and I put down a deposit that afternoon before leaving his studio, feeling like I finally had a clear path to the other side of this mess. The waiting period stretched out, but I used it to keep going to therapy every week, working with a counselor who helped me untangle my grief about Mom from my anger about the secrets and my guilt about the tattoo. She had me write letters to Mom that I never sent, processing all the complicated feelings about loving someone who'd been broken by things I'd never fully understand. And slowly, I started separating Mom's trauma from my own identity and finding compassion for both of us. Dad and I kept having our Thursday dinners, and one evening I asked if he'd go with me to visit Mom's grave, something neither of us had done since the funeral, because it felt too hard. He agreed, and the following Sunday, we drove out to the cemetery together, parking near the section where Mom was buried and walking across the grass to her headstone. I knelt down and traced her name with my fingers, while Dad stood behind me with his hand on my shoulder, and I started talking to her like she could hear me, telling her about the tattoo and everything that happened, and how I was getting it removed. I explained that I wasn't ashamed of her, but that I finally understood the pain behind those drawings, and I wanted to honor her healing and her strength instead of wearing the symbols of her wounds on my body forever. Dad cried quietly and added his own words about missing her and wishing he'd pushed harder to get her help when she was alive, and we stayed there for almost an hour, just talking to her and to each other about memories and regrets and hopes for moving forward. The final laser session with Dr. Lauer achieved as much fading as the technology could manage, leaving only the faintest ghost of the original design visible on my skin like a watermark. She took photos for her records and told me the results were excellent, that Troy would have a clean canvas to work with for the cover piece, and she wished me well with the rest of my journey, while noting that my commitment to fixing this situation had been remarkable. I thanked her for treating me with respect through the whole process, when she could have easily judged me, and she said everyone makes mistakes, and what matters is taking responsibility and doing the work to make things right. 3 months after that first consultation, I sat in Troy's chair on a Saturday morning with 8 hours blocked out for the cover session, watching in the mirror as he transferred the stencil of the oak tree design onto my shoulder and started outlining the trunk. The buzzing of the tattoo machine and the sharp pain of the needle felt familiar, but different this time, like I was building something instead of just marking myself with someone else's trauma, and I focused on breathing through the discomfort while Troy worked steadily across my skin. He took breaks every couple hours to let me rest and eat something, and during one break, he told me about other clients he'd helped transform painful reminders into meaningful art, saying that's what made this work worthwhile for him. The tree took shape slowly across the afternoon, branches spreading and leaves filling in and roots wrapping around the curves of my shoulder, and by the time Troy finished the final shading and wiped away the excess ink, I had a memorial tattoo that actually honored Mom's strength and resilience, instead of broadcasting the worst things she'd survived. Looking at it in the mirror, I felt something release in my chest, this weight I'd been carrying for months finally lifting, because I'd taken responsibility for my mistake and done the hard work to make it right, and I could move forward, knowing I'd learned to forgive both Mom and myself for being imperfect people, trying our best with the understanding we had. That's my version of events, but I know you've got your own take. What would you have done in my place? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading through them. The best part of this channel is seeing how you all see the same story differently.